On va démarrer. Bonjour, bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody, and welcome for the second session of the Week of Debate with Climate Chance. After the opening session yesterday, there are now sectorial debates that are going to take place. And other participants are going to join us. But I'd like to welcome our guests. First, from the Mr. Beaumont from the Michelin, Charlène Coissy, Observatory of Mobilities, Guy Debars, Managing Director of the GART. And we will give a word of introduction first. The Director of Climate Change was supposed to come, but he's not here, so we say hello anyway. Climate Chance is an association that wants to be at the heart of, to gather all non-state actors and to offer climate strategies. This includes territorial collectivities, NGOs, and all the collectives or groupings that are within the climate change tackling for citizens as well. So we have three main activities. Along the year, we organize events to mobilize our coalitions and actions. There are events on the African country, but also on the global scale. This year, we weren't able to hold our summit, which was supposed to be organized in Rwanda to support our African coalitions, but we have organized a cycle of workshops and webinars dedicated since the month of September. And we thank all the participants who were very numerous. And the Climate Chance Association is also an online platform on which we try to valorize initiatives, enhance them, and actions in terms of adaptation, mitigation. Sorry, there is a connection problem. I'm back. Sorry for that. Please, I apologize for that. So I was talking about the second pillar of Climate Chance. We enhance initiatives.
Climate Change, c'est aussi depuis cette année un plaidoyer qui a été adressé en amont des décisions et des débats européens sur
an advocacy, working on advocacy for new plans to relaunch and it is an observatory of which has been active for 3 years now to testify, analysis, and identify the great trends and weak signals on climate through different focuses, a territorial focus, an adaptation focus, as well as a financial focus. And this was published in September recently. And today we will present one of the 6 sectors in our report for climate per sector, the sectorial report. It is about transportation today. And this is why we have organized with Guilain Favier, who has worked on this topic for several months. We worked on analyzing all these trends in transportation, and we will be able to tell you what happened not only in 2019, as usual, but also in 2020 with the impact of the COVID-19 on the strategy of the actors. And we cannot today speak about climate as we did in the past. This is why we are going to discuss today, should we accelerate the climate strategies in the transportation sector? I'm going to give the floor to Guilain Favier, who is going to present us with the great trends today and his analysis.
Alors, merci Antoine pour cette introduction.
Thank you,
et bonjour
Antoine, for this
bonjour
presentation, and hello
Alors, comme le dit
everyone.
Antoine, l'objectif cette année
Antoine said, the
sur ce rapport
objective
transport, c'est
today
bien de
for this
démontrer
transportation
l'action en
report is to
2019
show
des différents
the
acteurs
actions of the great actors
et comment cette action
for
a été
climate
impactée
and
par
how this
la crise que
action
nous
was
vivons aujourd'hui.
impacted by the crisis
Donc, je
we
vais
are
rentrer tout de suite sur
experiencing today.
les
So
grosses
I am going
tendances,
to
les tendances de fond
focus on
du
the
secteur
big
du
trends
transport.
in the
Donc, en
transport
2019, les
sector.
émissions
In
du
2019,
secteur ont progressé
the
de
emissions
0,5%.
were increase of
On ne voit pas
0.5%.
Ouais, le suivant.
Next slide.
Voilà,
So
donc les émissions ont
0.5%,
progressé de
an
0,5% en
increase
2019. C'est une
of global
progression qui est un peu
transport
plus faible
emission
que les années
by
précédentes. Et il faut
0.5
bien
in
garder en tête que
2019.
ce secteur, il représente toujours
So
un
this
quart
sector
environ
still
de nos
represents
émissions de CO2.
1/4
Et
of
surtout,
the
c'est l'un des secteurs
global
les plus carbonés, avec
carbon
seulement
emissions,
3% de
and
la
only
consommation énergétique qui est fournie par
3.7% of
les
energy
renouvelables.
consumption met
Par
by
renouvelable, c'est
RE.
surtout dans ce
By
secteur des
renewable
biocarburants et un petit peu d'électrification.
renewable energies that are
Alors, on
dedicated
l'a
to
tous
this
vu
sector. So
en
we
mars,
all
avril
saw
au cours du
in March,
confinement, avec les
April,
restrictions de
with the
déplacement pour près de
restrictions
50% de la
and
population mondiale,
impossibility to
on a vu
travel, we
une
saw
chute brutale de la demande,
a great
principalement
fall in
dans
demand,
l'aérien et dans le
especially
transport
in
terrestre.
road and
Donc, il est
aviation.
logique que
And this,
la
therefore, it is
réponse actuelle à
logical
cette
that
crise
the answer
dans le
to
secteur
this
du transport soit
crisis
massive.
in this
Et vous le voyez sur
transportation
ce
sector
graphique qui montre
be
le
massive.
montant des
And
plans de
you see
relance dans les pays
how
du G20
the
par secteur.
recovery
Le
plans
secteur du transport bénéficie de 240 milliards de dollars
really
d'aide. Et ce qui
emphasize
est un
the
peu préoccupant, ce
transport.
qu'on a noté, c'est que
And what is
57%
important
des fonds
is that
vont
50%
favoriser
of
indirectement
these
les
funds
combustibles
will
fossiles,
favor
ceci sans
the
contrepartie environnementale
fossil fuels
vraiment
without
stricte.
climate safety.
Donc, je vais rentrer maintenant dans
So now
chacun
I'm going
des
to
secteurs. Donc,
go
je vais commencer par
into
le
the
secteur
different
terrestre, le routier.
sectors. So
Alors,
for
ce qui a été
road
marquant également cette
transport, what
année,
was
on le voit
very
sur
marking
ce
this year,
graphique
as
que
we
vous avez
can
en bas à
see
droite,
on
c'est
the graph
l'évolution
that
de
you
la
see on
fréquentation
bottom
des transports
right of your
publics dans
screen,
diverses villes du monde. Donc, toutes les villes ont été
you
impactées
see
par
that
cette
all
crise.
of
Cette
the
crise
cities
est
were
globale et
impacted by the
sans
global
précédent.
crisis and
Et
unprecedented
les opérateurs de
crisis,
transport
and
public
the
ont été durement impactés.
public
Donc, j'ai mis quelques
operators
chiffres. Par
were
exemple, à Lima, c'est
especially hit by this
moins
crisis,
93% de
minus
fréquentation, moins 72% à
93% in
Los
terms of
Angeles.
ridership in
Donc, tous ont
Lima,
été
for example,
impactés,
minus
mais le challenge le plus
72% in
gros
Los Angeles. So
reste
everyone was impacted,
dans
but
les
the
villes des
biggest
pays en
challenge
développement, où les
remains
transports
in
publics
developing
sont souvent
city where public
informels,
transport
sont des
is
transports
informal
uniquement
and
privés et bénéficient
usually
d'aucune aide
privately owned, and they
de la
didn't
région
benefit
ou de l'État. Donc,
benefit
c'est
from
particulièrement
helps
préoccupant
from
parce que
the
c'est
state
déjà
or
dans ces
region.
régions du monde
So
que
it
l'accès au
is in
transport
these
public
regions of
est
the
déficitaire.
world
À l'échelle
where
globale, vous
transport
avez
is usually
50%
already
de la
difficult. So
population
usually you have
urbaine qui a
50%
un accès facilité au
of the
transport public,
population
donc
that
50% qui
have
n'a pas cet
access
accès.
to public
Alors, au cours de
transport,
cette
but the
crise,
others do
la
not.
réponse qui est très
So the
positive,
answer, which was
c'est
very
l'engouement
positive,
pour
is
le
the new
vélo. Les
taste for
collectivités locales ont développé
cycling,
massivement
bicycling,
et très rapidement
and
des
people
infrastructures
answered
vélo pour favoriser
positively
également
to
la
it, and
marche.
there were infrastructures
Une base
created
de données en
for
ligne a recensé près de
cycling,
900 actions
new
d'urgence
bicycle
pour
lanes
favoriser le
built
vélo ou la
to
marche.
favor
Donc, c'est un signal très positif
walking
et la
or
crise a permis de
cycling. It is a
renforcer
very
en fait
positive
cet
signal,
engouement pour le vélo qu'on
and
notait déjà
this taste
précédemment.
for
Et
cycling
ce qui est
was
très
also
important
encouraged
de
in the past, and
noter,
it's very
c'est que
important to note that
ceci, on l'observe partout. C'est pas
this is
uniquement en
observed
Europe ou à Paris
everywhere.
qu'on
It is
a
not
vu ce qu'on
just
voit
in
aujourd'hui,
Europe.
mais on l'a vu par exemple à
We have
Bogota, qui a
seen, for
inauguré
example, in
84
Bogota,
kilomètres de
that
pistes cyclables en un
84
temps record.
kilometers of cycling
Et
lanes
le
were
point
built.
négatif, du coup,
And the negative
également, par
point,
contre, avec cette
on
baisse
the other
des
hand,
transports
with
publics, c'est
this
qu'une partie des usagers va se
decrease of
reporter
public
sur
transport,
la
is
voiture
that the
individuelle.
activity is
Donc, il faut
now
savoir que le
put
marché de
more
la
set
voiture
on
individuelle,
cars.
le marché de la
So
voiture, de l'automobile, il était
individual
déjà
cars,
impacté depuis,
and the
en
automobile
2018, les ventes,
automotive industry was
de véhicules neufs
impacted
avaient déjà
with
baissé et cette
the
baisse s'est
new
accrue en
vehicles
2019 et donc bien sûr
decrease in
maintenant
terms
au
of
cœur de la crise.
sales.
Donc, dans ce marché un
In this
petit peu morose, les véhicules électriques,
sad
eux, leurs
market,
ventes ont progressé de 15%
the
en
sales
2019.
have increased.
Et je ne sais pas si vous
Global
voyez bien
sales decreased by
sur ce graphique à droite,
6.3% in
on montre l'évolution
2019, and but
des
for
ventes de voitures électriques et des voitures
electric
hybrides entre
vehicles
2019 et
in
2020.
2019,
Mais
it
elles ont été
went
moins
up
impactées par la
plus
crise que le
15%.
marché
They were
mondial.
less impacted
On voit
by
une
the
baisse de
crisis, the global
14% des ventes de
crisis. We
véhicules
see
électriques,
only
alors que la baisse est de
40% of
28%
decrease
pour
global,
l'ensemble des véhicules. Ce qu'on voit aussi, par contre, sur ce
whereas
graphique,
sales
c'est que
have decreased
le marché
globally
du
for all
véhicule
vehicles.
électrique est encore concentré
So
dans 3 régions, en
the
Chine,
market
en Europe
for
et aux États-Unis,
electric vehicles is
et que
concentrated on
la part de
China,
marché
Europe,
totale, elle
United
est encore
States,
très
and the
faible.
global
On a,
share is
en
still very
2019, c'était
weak.
3% de
In
part de marché pour les véhicules
2019,
électriques,
3% of market
alors qu'en
share,
parallèle, la
whereas
part des SUV,
the
elle est
share
de
of
41%. Si on
SUVs
va dans des pays
represented
comme l'Australie ou les
41%. So
États-Unis, c'est une voiture sur
countries
2
like
vendue
Australia,
qui
one
est
car out of
un
two
SUV.
is an
Alors la crise,
SUV.
elle a aussi
So the
permis
crisis has
d'accélérer aujourd'hui
also
les
enabled
réflexions sur la démobilité,
accelerating
les réflexions sur la
reflections
réduction de la demande de
around
transport.
reduction
On le
of
voit tous aujourd'hui, on
transportation,
est tous un peu coincés chez nous
pushing
en
for
télétravail.
cleaner
Donc ça
vehicles.
permet
We are
de
all
raviver ces questions de
teleworking. We are not
comment les
using our
villes
vehicles. And so
peuvent réduire
how
leur
can
demande de transport.
cities think
Donc, c'est
about
une réflexion
reducing
qui est portée massivement
transportation, this is
par les villes.
something
Et
that has been
une tendance qui est vraiment louable cette
reflected
année,
upon
enfin en
by
2019 en tout
cities.
cas, c'est qu'on a vu des villes
And
africaines,
we have
donc au
seen
Cameroun,
African
à Douala
cities
et
in
Yaoundé,
Cameroon,
des villes qui ont inauguré leur plan de
cities
mobilité
which
urbaine durable. Donc
inaugurated their
ça essaime hors d'Europe.
D-mobility
C'était des
plan.
phénomènes qui jusqu'à maintenant
These are
étaient surtout
phenomena
concentrés en Europe
which
et
up
qui
to
s'étendent
now only
dans le
existed
monde
in
entier.
Europe, but now we see them
Donc
in
voilà
other parts of the
pour le
world.
transport routier. Je vais
So
passer
this
maintenant au transport
was
ferroviaire.
about the road
Donc
transport. I'm going to
les
now
indicateurs
move on
du transport
to rail
ferroviaire qu'on
transport.
a pour l'année 2018
So in
sont tous positifs.
2018,
On note
we see
une
that there's a
extension du
positive
réseau,
boost,
une
an
hausse du transport de passagers,
expansion
une
of the
hausse du
network plus
transport de fret.
0.5%,
Vous voyez
plus
sur le graphique
3%
l'évolution de
passengers. You
la
can see
demande
on
de
the graph
transport
the
de passagers. Donc on note qu'elle
evolution
est
of
vraiment
the
concentrée
demand for
en
passenger
Asie. Le ferroviaire,
transportation
de
by
manière
rail.
générale, est concentré dans
And
quelques pays, la Chine,
and
l'Inde,
it's
l'Union
usually
européenne.
concentrated in China,
Mais quand on regarde, alors si ces signaux
Europe.
sont positifs, quand
But
on regarde
if
un
we
peu
have
plus dans le
positive
détail,
signals, we
on se
can
rend compte
see
que
when we
cette
look
expansion
into the
aujourd'hui du
details, we
ferroviaire,
look at this
elle répond
expansion
surtout à des objectifs économiques
responds to
et également
economic
à des objectifs
objectives and
stratégiques,
to
ou des objectifs
strategic
d'accès à
objectives
aux ressources
for
minières,
access
hydrocarbures,
to
et peu à
resources,
des objectifs climat
hydrocarbons,
ou à des
and
objectifs de
climate
report modal.
objectives as well.
Donc, deux exemples qui sont assez
So two
emblématiques, c'est
examples
que
which are quite
l'essentiel aujourd'hui de
representative and
l'expansion du réseau, elle
emblematic.
se fait en
The
Chine sur des lignes
expansion
à
of
grande
the
vitesse,
rails lines
dont le but
in
à
China,
demi-avoué est
high-speed rail
surtout de
lines,
stimuler la croissance
to
économique du
stimulate the
pays.
economic growth.
Et un exemple également pour le
And one
transport de fret, en
example for freight
2019, la
transportation in
plus grande ligne de fret qui a
2019,
été
the
inaugurée
greatest
est une ligne
line
toujours en Chine, de
is
fret qui est dédiée uniquement
once
au
again
charbon,
in
donc qui
China,
va relier
dedicated to
des mines de
coal,
charbon au nord vers les
transportation
centrales
coal
thermiques
because of the
au sud.
mines in the
Et la
north of
capacité
the
de cette
country,
ligne est de
and the
200 000 tonnes de charbon
capacity
par an.
of this
C'est plus que la
of this
production
line to
allemande
transport
de
coal
charbon,
is
par
very
exemple, à
high.
titre, pour avoir un ordre de grandeur.
So
Donc à côté de
just to
ça, on a
give
quand même
you
des signaux
an
très
idea,
positifs,
we
trois
have
signaux très
very
positifs
positive
du côté du rail.
signals for rail
L'électrification se
transport.
poursuit. Aujourd'hui, c'est le
Electrification is
secteur du transport qui est le
ongoing.
plus
It
électrifié et
one of the
l'électrification
most
continue. Et
electrified
surtout, cette
transport
électrification
modes.
peut être boostée avec les nouvelles
And this will
technologies.
be
On le
probably
voit
boosted with new
dans certaines régions
technologies in certain
européennes avec
regions,
l'avènement
European
de trains à
regions, with
batterie et de
the
trains à hydrogène.
coming of
On note
hydrogen
également de
trains
nouveaux
as well.
outils qui sont employés
We have new
à tous les
tools
étages,
as
que ce soit au
well,
niveau de l'État ou au niveau local, pour
locally
redynamiser le
or from the
transport de
state
passagers.
to
Donc, j'ai mis en exemple
really
ici la baisse de la
bring new
TVA
incentives and acceleration to this rail
le transport de
transport
passagers
and the
en Allemagne.
transformation.
Et
We
on a
have
vu également un exemple
so
en France de
VAT
coopérative citoyenne qui s'est
cut
réappropriée
in
dans ces lignes.
Germany.
Et enfin, le troisième point positif que je voulais mettre en avant, c'était la
And
résilience
the
du
third
fret
aspect I
ferroviaire
wanted to tackle was the
par rapport à
rail
d'autres secteurs.
freight,
Donc, il s'est maintenu et a même été favorisé
which has
par la
maintained
crise,
and was
puisqu'il est plus
favored by
résilient
the crisis, in fact,
aux restrictions sanitaires. Donc, on a
due to
notamment sur
the
les lignes qui relient
restrictions
la
of the
Chine à l'Europe
pandemic.
une hausse du transport de fret
So
sur le premier
in
semestre 2020.
Europe, there was an increase
Alors, pour ce qui est
during the
du
first
transport
term of
maritime
rail freight.
maintenant,
From
on
now,
a
we're going to
également
move on to
les dernières données que nous avons,
the
qui sont
next
les données de l'année
point.
2018.
For maritime
Donc, on note
transport,
une baisse des
these are
émissions de
data from
CO2
the
alors que la
previous
demande
years, a
de fret
decrease of
maritime a augmenté.
CO2
Donc, c'est un secteur
GHG emissions.
qui voit une très nette progression de son
This sector
efficacité
is
énergétique.
seeing an
Ce
increase
qui est
in terms
notable
of
en
energy. What
2020
is
dans ce secteur, c'est la
notable in
nouvelle
2020
norme
in this
de
sector
l'Organisation
is the
maritime
new
internationale pour
norms, the new
réduire la
standards
pollution de l'air au
to
soufre. Donc, on a un objectif
produce
de réduction de
sulfur,
cette pollution et on a
so
également un
low
objectif de
sulfur
réduction des émissions
fuel
qui a
foil will
été
be
écrit
used
en 2018, qui est la réduction
in
des émissions de 40%
2018.
d'ici 2030.
So we see
Alors,
there was
face à ces deux contraintes,
reduction.
les
We
compagnies
want to
maritimes
have, so
adoptent
there was
deux
minus
stratégies
0.7% of emissions,
principalement.
but by
La première est de
2030, we'll have
substituer
minus
le fuel lourd, qui est le
40%.
carburant principal, par le gaz
So
naturel liquéfié ou par des fuels à faible teneur
we
en
have
sulfure.
fuel,
Alors, cette
low
technologie a l'inconvénient
sulfur fuel
d'augmenter
foil,
les émissions de
and we
méthane
want
et les
to,
émissions de lac
this
carbone,
might
qui sont également
increase
des gaz à
methane
effet de serre.
leaks or black
Et l'autre
carbon.
technologie
But there's another
qui est favorisée
technology which
massivement
is
de
favored
par son coût actuellement,
massively by
c'est
its
ce
cost,
qu'on appelle les
namely,
scrubbers.
is what we call
Ce sont
scrubbers.
des dispositifs qui permettent
These
de
are
neutraliser
devices
les
to
échappements
neutralize
de la combustion et donc
the
de
combustion
réduire la
effect
pollution au
and
soufre.
remove
Alors,
the
l'inconvénient
SOx.
majeur de
So
cette technologie, c'est que la
the
plupart du temps, l'eau de mer qui est servie
negative aspect is that
pour
usually
réduire
the
cette pollution au soufre est rejetée
seawater
dans
that
les
is
océans
used
et
is
augmente
then
l'acidification des
brought
océans.
back into the
Donc, vous
ocean,
voyez
and it
sur le
creates
graphique à
an
droite
acidification
l'évolution
of the
assez
ocean.
impressionnante
So
nombre de navires qui sont
there
équipés de
is
tous ces
a
dispositifs.
pollution by the
Alors, ce
ships in the
secteur
world.
a également
This
été
sector
impacté
has
par la
also
crise,
been impacted by the
principalement le
crisis
secteur de
and
passagers
principally
qui a connu un recul massif.
for
On l'a vu
passengers.
que
The impact on
les
passengers
croisières et les
was
ferries.
very
Et en
high,
revanche, le transport, le fret maritime, lui, s'est
but
maintenu à très bon
maritime
niveau et a
freight
montré, comme le fret ferroviaire, en
has
fait,
been resilient.
sa résilience. Et un second impact de la
Second
crise,
impact of
c'est
the
la réduction
crisis,
du
the
prix du
low
pétrole
oil
qui augmente,
prices, the price reduction,
qui augmente la durée du retour sur
and
investissement des scrubbers et
increase the
réduit la demande pour ces
ROI for
dispositifs.
scrubbers.
Donc, il faudra suivre comment
So we will need
ces
to
dispositifs évoluent dans les
monitor
prochaines années.
how these
Et enfin, je vais finir
schemes
sur
evolve in
l'aérien.
time. And I'm going to end
Alors,
my
vous le voyez sur
presentation
ce graphique,
with
la
aviation.
croissance du
As you
transport
can
de
see on the
passagers est
graph,
vraiment exponentielle
the
depuis des
increase
décennies. En 2019, on avait encore
was
une hausse des
very
émissions
high.
de
In
2%.
2019, we
Ce qui est vraiment
still had
flagrant sur ce
plus
graphique, c'est
2% in
qu'aucun
terms of
événement majeur
emissions,
des dernières
but no
décennies n'avait
major
impacté cette
event
croissance,
in the
que ce
last
soit le
decade
choc
had
pétrolier, ou que
impacted
ce soit encore la crise financière de
the
2008,
climate.
alors qu'on voit aujourd'hui un stop
Even
qui est vraiment
the
brutal, avec une réduction de
financial
60% quand même
crisis,
de
the
la
economic
demande de
crisis,
passagers, même si c'est encore une estimation.
we can see that
Et surtout, l'industrie mise sur un
the
retour à la
industry
normale
is
avant
hoping on a
2023,
return to
voire
normal in
2024.
2023 or
Donc, dans ce secteur, le
2024.
premier
In
impact de
this
la crise,
sector, the first
c'est que
impact of
l'industrie
the
a
crisis
immédiatement
is that the
renégocié ses
industry
objectifs
has
climatiques.
immediately
L'industrie
changed
avait mis
its
en
and
place
reset
un
its
programme de
climate
compensation
objectives,
volontaire des émissions,
renegotiated its climate
CORSIA,
objectives.
et
There's a
ligne
new
de base en
baseline
fait,
for the
de
carbon
ce
offset
programme a
program,
été
CORSIA,
revue. Et donc, ce programme, aujourd'hui, il se
and
retrouve
now
allégé.
this program
Autrement,
is
les compagnies
lightened.
aériennes misent
The
toujours
air
sur les mêmes stratégies,
companies
qui sont l'optimisation des
base
opérations
their actions
aéroportuaires,
on their
l'usage généralisé
strategies,
des
the general
biocarburants,
use of
ainsi que la technologie
biofuels,
et
as well
l'électrification.
as
Mais elle
technology,
mise toujours sur un doublement
electrification,
de la demande de transport de passagers d'ici 2050. Donc, ce qui est
and they're
critiqué
still
à raison
planning a double
par
of
les ONG.
demand by
Et le deuxième impact
2050.
de cette
And the second
pandémie
impact
sur le
of this
secteur,
pandemic on
c'est
the sector
qu'on a un
is
recul
that
des États sur
the state
les taxes qu'ils souhaitaient ou allaient mettre en place sur
we're supposed to put in place some
les
taxes
passagers ou
for
sur le transport de
passengers,
fret.
namely, and
Et
these
enfin,
were
on a vu bien
delayed.
sûr
So there's a delay
un soutien
in
massif des
of the
États aux compagnies
eco-tax
aériennes,
and
que ce soit par
great
des
final
prêts garantis ou même par
assistance
des renationalisations.
without climate
Donc,
safeguards.
je vous ai mis les montants ici. Les pays du
I
G20
put the
ont donné
amount
110
here
milliards de
for
dollars
the
quand même aux compagnies
G20,
aériennes. Dans
$110
l'Union
million,
européenne, c'est 33 milliards de
for
dollars.
the European Union,
Donc,
$33
pour
million.
conclure rapidement sur
And to
le
quickly
secteur
conclude
du transport, on
on
voit donc
the
que la pandémie, on s'y
transportation
attendait, elle met un coup
field,
d'arrêt brutal
there
à
was
la
a
hausse des
brutal
émissions
stop
qu'on observait
in terms
récemment.
of the increase
Mais
of
surtout, elle
emissions
permet de
recently
mettre en
during the
valeur, elle a
crisis, but
renforcé
this
des tendances de fond qu'on observait déjà les années précédentes.
showcased
Donc certaines sont positives, comme l'essor
positive
de la
aspects,
mobilité
such
douce,
as
de la marche et du
the
vélo dans les villes.
mobility, an increase in terms
Et
of
par contre,
mobility,
on voit
use
qu'on a
of
un recul dans
bicycles,
certains secteurs, donc
and we have
principalement
seen in
dans
certain
l'aérien,
sectors,
avec
and namely in
un report à plus
aviation,
tard des objectifs climatiques.
a
Donc voici pour la conclusion de ce secteur.
more
Antoine, je te
positive
laisse.
aspects in terms of climate as well. Thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you for all this work that was done for several months to testify on the trends in 2019 on these four sectors and the disruptions brought by COVID-19. Now I will say hello to our guest, Nicolas Beaumont, Senior VP Sustainable Development and Mobility at Michelin, Charlène Kwasi, Head of Development Observatoire des Mobilités Africaines, African Mobility, and Guy Lebras.
Conceptionne CEDAPA.
Merci beaucoup, bonjour à tous. On va démarrer tout de suite sur ce qui nous a impacté évidemment et ce qui continue à nous impacter cette année, la crise du Covid. Vous l'avez entendu avec la présentation de Guylain, cette pandémie a bouleversé toute l'économie avec des effets notables sur le domaine du transport. L'un des effets, outre donc l'effet bénéfique sur les transports doux en effet, c'est que le revers de la crise, c'est que dans beaucoup de pays, les personnes se sont reportées sur leur voiture pour des raisons sanitaires et ont délaissé les transports en commun. C'est notamment ce qui se passe en France. Guy Lebras, tout l'enjeu maintenant, c'est de faire revenir finalement les citoyens dans les transports en commun. Et c'est là-dessus que sont mobilisées les autorités responsables de transport que vous représentez. Alors, comment y arriver? Comment faire revenir les citoyens dans les transports en commun?
Bon, d'abord, merci de m'avoir invité. Et puis, je voudrais aussi remercier Climate Chance.
Thank you for inviting me. And I'd like to also thank Climate Chance and all the team to have carried out this study, a very interesting study, because it gives an international perspective, which is important. And we work on these aspects, and I think we can put our knowledge in common on these topics to have an approach which is truly global on the subject. By hearing the presentation that was just made, I remember an event which now shows that history is just a perpetual restart and it duplicates itself. And when our president was elected, he launched a great, the Grenelle for environment, a great event. And all the people who are interested in about these environmental topics were happy. But then there was a financial crisis a year after in the United States, and a few words after, I remember Nicolas Sarkozy said, now the environment, enough with the environment. So finally, it is a perpetual new beginning. And for this Citizen Convention for Climate, people have complained that all the actions promised and implemented without any filters by three jokers that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, mentioned. Now, we had the crisis, we experienced it, and things didn't happen as we expected. For this crisis, what I see are negative aspects and positive aspects as well, of course. In a country like France, I know that this is an international meeting, and I would like to say that what I say is true for France, where public transportation is organized by local collectivities, the organizational mobility and financed highly by public funds, since there's the intervention of local collectivities, local authorities, and a specific tax for mobility, which is very important since in average, it represents 47% of the total of financing for transportation. So the end user only pays a very low price, 20% of the cost for his transportation. And of course, the crisis has very quickly impacted, if I might say so, the economic model and the financing model of our system, since, as I said, the major part is based on employees' tax. And so when people were made partly redundant, were partly unemployed, the impact was huge. So there's a certain latency in terms of results. The impact is low on the financial aspect, 8% for the mobility, and about 20% for the loss in terms of revenue. But globally, for the crisis, we will notice figures of a 20% decrease in terms of mobility and 30% for revenue. So the main question is to know how we can compensate this to enable the offer to remain as it is now. In terms of use of transportation, we know that it decreased very largely compared to a normal use. And today, the average is much higher than it was. It is around 30–40% in terms of use of transportation, but it is not yet at its normal peak. In any case, the offer is quite important and the attendance rate is weak. So how can we have people use public transportation again. We must ensure the financial and economic sustainability of the model. And this is an international question. The Germans have put several €100,000 on the table to do so. And proportionally, if we look at what it's very important compared to their country size. In France, we're counting on 1.2 billion euros and roughly 450 million euros for public transportation for daily use in urban areas. And I believe we are still far from the effort that was provided in many countries. And of course, the organization, the GART, which I'm part of, is compensating, which is a compensation at the same level by other states. The other difficulty, if we remember what was said during the first part of the crisis, it's that finally public transportation represented a danger. We had to maintain the social distancing, and they could be a vector for the dissemination of the pandemic. So they were, in fact, the public transport were proven not to be clusters for the COVID-19 pandemic. And if we look at it from this point of view, we can truly reassure users for them to come back to transportation modes, public transport. Of course, cycling, using bicycles is very positive. In France, we are 13 years back in terms of the use of bicycles in the city, but we are conscious that we cannot replace an RER line. Trains in France that go from the suburbs to Paris and to also link east and west parts of Paris. We have to make sure that bicycle is being developed, but that mass public transportation need to be also sustainable and represent a good economic model. We need to continue to support this offer with development plans. This is the object of the call for projects that was launched, and we need to support, of course, the finance of collectivities and to help the public benefit from these modes of transportation as being one of the most highly performing in the world. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you. So we see there's a dual problem. We need to reassure people. In Africa, the crisis has also made things more difficult and fragile. The public transport is not very efficient in parts, and you will maybe tell us how we can strengthen the offer and for it to be reliable, secure. Otherwise, there will be an explosion of car use, individual car use. And this is not pushed forward necessarily in the recovery plans. Can you take the floor, Charline? Your microphone, please. Charline? Sorry. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for this presentation, for Climate Chance, for this debate of great quality, and thank you for this sectorial report. In Africa, indeed, we are noticing different trends, and that has been the case for several years. The states are turning towards mass transportation modes, of course, because we know that since the 1980s, with the structural plans, transportation public companies have seen their system really disrupted, and informal transportation has taken over and represents a big part of transportation today. So the informal transportation, as Guylain said, is a system which relies on private transportation associations, companies, vehicle owners who use taxis, minivans which you see all over Africa, Western Africa, you see a lot of that as well. And they really represent the main part of transportation, because I have said there's a big gap, a big lack in public transportation in Africa, and it cannot answer to the demand. So the main objectives in terms of a strategy of the governments is to support these mass transportation modes with buses. So buses that can carry a high number of people, and these are used in most African cities. I know it is the case in Tanzania and in cities of the south of Africa. So they are more advanced usually on these questions. But in Western Africa, there was a true will, a true desire to strengthen, to reinforce this public transportation, because I have said the private sector for transportation is 80% of the demand. So if we talk about the French RERA, it is in Abidjan, the vans carry 1 million passengers a day, knowing that the public transportation company will transport about 700,000. So you can see the ratio here. And it is interesting to see that this informal transportation mode needs to be modernized and perhaps needs to be made cleaner, because this mode is producing the gas emissions. And we must integrate these modes of transportation, the informal modes, to the future public transportation, because once again, things are slower in Africa, in Western Africa, and Africa in general, but there is a true will from the governments to satisfy the demand and to minimize or perhaps integrate the informal transportation and make it, but reduce it. As I said, they are very dominant for the moment, and that leads to different issues. Of course, we have security issues, pollution issues. So there is an existing structure, but it's not enough professionalized. And that is the objective today in Africa, professionalizing the transport sector and putting users at the heart of this system. Thank you very much, Charline. I'm going to give the floor to Nicolas Beaumont, who is a Director of Development and Sustainable Development Mobility at Michelin. He works also internationally with the Move-In Lab, created by Michelin on sustainable mobility. There's also Transport Decarbonation Alliance, which brings together cities, countries, and companies. And Nicolas, you also have joined Some for All, Sustainable Mobility for All, which brings together all stakeholders to transform the sector. So you have a fairly broad vision of the sector and international vision. Would you say that the crisis has accelerated the transformation of the sector in terms of sustainable mobility, or on the opposite, make it more fragile, as we have seen in aviation and difficulties in terms of new technologies? What is the situation, Nicolas? Please use your microphone. I didn't see you at first, Nicolas. Thank you. Hello, Concepcion. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you today and to support climate change and with the Foundation Michelin, which has supported for many years climate change now. And I am delighted to be with you today. So what could we say? We can say that the crisis, and that was the question you asked, is accelerating a transformation. What is also clear is that the crisis shows well, as it was the case in the past, that mobility is absolutely necessary to progress. And mobility for humans is the access to food, access to friends, to work, as we have seen during the COVID crisis, that the mobility changed. It was different, but it doesn't mean that there was less mobility. And that is the question, to know what will happen in the coming years and how we will find a new balance, a better balance, and how the sanitary crisis can integrate as one of the criteria, take into account as a robust criteria. And we said for public transportation, there was a perception, an idea that when in times of crisis, as in the COVID crisis, public transportation were not robust. But we see that this is not the case. And between what people perceive, think, and reality, there's a big difference. And in the different international commissions Michelin participates in, we have seen the different initiatives from the World Bank, forums. Moving on, we see that globally, the direction is not changing. It is unchanged. But thus not changing, some things go quicker than others. You talked about aviation before, and of course we saw a high decrease of aviation transportation, but because this transformation is changing more quickly, and the plane companies are working on hydrogen, clean energies, etc. So we see a lot of accelerators there. And for these big instances, the World Bank, for example, with the forum, is not changing 1 millimeter. And this, we see that the international organizations need to be careful of that. And we have seen that in the report by the observatory, that all the bricks exist. The question is to put the bricks together and to work to have all the stakeholders work together, all the shareholders work together. So all the organization are doing things better and better. And the misunderstandings we could have in the beginning because of a lack of vocabulary, everything is changing, disappearing, and things are becoming more ecosystemic. On the other hand, the international organizations are noticing we must do things locally. And this is the case for Mobility for All, which published a policy for mobility to go towards more sustainable mobility. And this is applied for South Africa with the support of the World Bank Development for South Africa, to which we take part in, to help in terms of the transformation of South Africa to go towards more sustainable mobility. And with Climate Chance, the Fondation Michelin was able to create a roadmap for the decarbonation of Ivory Coast, and we are also working on a roadmap for Senegal. So we see that all these organizations, which were very general, are beginning to apply the concepts. And we also see other problematics that had appeared. The World Bank and the representative of the World Bank was also present during the forum. And there are also second-hand vehicles that will probably end up in Africa. I know that this is an important point for Charlene. This was clearly mentioned by the World Bank and more generally by the international institutions. So what we see, and I'm very optimistic, it's that things are working. And there is always the idea of having more mobility, enabling people to be more mobile with no impact. And Charlene mentioned it before, and Mr. Lebras also, we cannot talk about decarbonation because by nature, we need to tackle environmental, social, societal aspects. And we see that mobilité durable, sustainable mobility, we have 4 million dead on the roads every year. We need to be more accessible, more efficient. We see that the silos are breaking up and disappearing, and that the actors are working on the different components together. So this is how I wanted to put things in a nutshell, and to talk about our involvement with the international entities. Thank you, Nicolas, for this optimistic message. Charlene, would you like to confirm that decarbonation is a topic that is starting to be taken into in Africa? Yes, absolutely, Concepcion. We have many projects that are being implemented on the field, and we talked about South Africa. Of course, South Africa is a pioneer in terms of electric in Africa, in terms of sales for individual electric cars. It is minimal compared to the Western world, of course, but Southern Africa is really in advance and really moving towards electric solutions, and it is counting on its energetic potential with the solar energy to implement new mobility electric solutions for public transportation, with tram buses, tramway in Casablanca, for example, or an electric line of buses in Marrakesh, Morocco. This is very encouraging. And there are a lot of manufacturers who are present on the territories. I'm thinking of Renault, PSA, for example, or Beyond Your Dreams, the Chinese manufacturer, who are all implementing new mobility solutions. You hear me well? Great. Perfect. So we also have in Western Africa a number of projects being implemented. I talked about Abidjan. We have 50 buses, electric buses with natural gas. So this is also part of the decarbonation plan on the national level. 2,000 are expected by 2021. This is an optimistic goal. In Dakar, there's also another project for BRT or trains, TR trains, which will be inaugurated soon to help reduce traffic in the area. This will move towards decarbonation. There's also a financial project financed by the United Nations, a program for environment, which is financing project for Dakar and Lagos, a big urban center in Africa, in order to use clean buses with biofuels without sulfur. And this is very impressive to see how Africa is moving ahead. We are very optimistic here because the opportunities are huge. The needs are also very high, and the governments are also pushed by the private sector, who is giving the movement, the step. And finally, the administration is very heavy. The procedures are heavy. We have projects. We talked about the impact of the COVID, whether it accelerated or jammed things. I would say not necessarily accelerated things, because the horizon for 2025, 2050 haven't really changed because of the crisis, because unfortunately, it is difficult to adapt in terms of emergency. With the COVID, for example, in terms of public transportation, we haven't seen any improvement. We have, quite the opposite, noticed all the vulnerabilities. And the politics are in place. I believe that things are going to work out, as we can say, and we have a roadmap in the Ivory Coast, as Nicolas Beaumont said, which is also pushing the whole sector in Senegal and Kenya. They're trying to do the same work and follow the same process. Africa is moving. Africa is really on the move, and we are happy about this. Thank you very much, Charlene. We are now going to turn towards Nicolas Beaumont, you work for Michelin, and you're working on this transition for a mobility company. You will tell us what that involves. And I also wanted to ask you to know whether the message is disseminated within the companies to change business models, perhaps for environmental reasons, but also for economic reasons. Is it what you use at Michelin and apply? Is that a message that is starting to be understood on the international level? The floor is yours, Nicolas. Nicolas, your microphone. Yes, it is a message that is beginning to be understood on the international level. And as I said before, we talked about financing modes, measures, but most of our countries, most of the societies are looking for balance between people, the planet, and the value creation. And what is extremely important is to be able each time to develop business models that enable the different players to create the value. Otherwise, we are always back with financing problems. There's a community of interest for moving on. We talk about mobility as a service. This is great, fabulous. But the question is, if there is no business model, things are not going to be developed. And there is an interesting point between groups working on infrastructure, engineering, and some groups who are more transport operators and digital startups as well, who think about what a business model could be and how we can deploy it. When we talk about electrification, all the questions of how the state can finance or not finance, use taxes on electricity used for transportation, and how can states replace the money that they get back from taxes on gas and diesel. If we are not able to take these into account and manage them, then things will not move on because the capitals are not available. And this makes things complicated. So looking at functionality is one way to prove that these business models are viable. And it is simple when we look at Michelin, for example, today. We are one of the biggest managers of fleet. And since we manage fleets, when we want to sell tires, for example, that is good for the environment, that has properties, it will be complicated to sell. Why? Because a lot of consumers are not ready to spend more for something that is good for the environment. Yes, for yogurt, yes, because it's good for health, but a better tire for environment is more complicated. If you manage fleets of trucks and that the fact of using this tire on the vehicles enables to the fleet managers to save gas, then they can save on their global payments and also be good for the planet and all values. Then it is not a constraint anymore. You create value for the company, which produces services and direct value in terms of money and reduction of costs. So this is this type of business model we need to use with formal, informal ways to make sure that this transformation goes faster and not be only connected to the ethical convictions of people or to laws and regulations that the states will put in place. So we need to find a balance with the regulations put in place by countries and also business models from different products and services that are at disposal. Thank you, Nicolas. It's very clear. So I'm going to finish with Guy Lebras. We're going back to France with collectivities and all of the questions of mobility beyond public transportation. Can you describe the trends that are observed and where we're going to, what we're heading to? And are we going to be able to stop the model of private cars? You said that an average most of the transport is made by private cars. How can we reverse this trend? Yes, indeed. The statistic was used in the study that we are speaking about today, and it is interesting because despite all the efforts produced, individual transportation, automobile, are widely used nationally, even if we can notice that in the metropolises, the modal share of public transport is relatively important, 30%. So we see that it is a complementary approach with the apparition of new mobilities. So this is a phenomena that is not didn't only appear during crisis. It dates back and from the efforts towards more mobility. And in December 2019, there was a law which was voted, orientation of mobility, which included that the authorities needed to, or for any French person on the territory, needed to have a specific organization of mobility. So this is an approach of interesting governance and important. And these organizing structures must manage the mobility. In the past, we talked about, now we're talking about authorities that manage mobility. So there's a sharing of transport modes, on-demand transport as well. And I would say that it can be organized in a complementary way, and what I like to call, to use of French terms, service mobility. It is a novelty that is important and integrated also in a very clear way in the law for mobility orientation. And there are some difficulties, of course, with the crisis. We had a lot of delays and things have been postponed for the law of orientation, but it will be important in terms of action for the coming month, at least in France. And what I would like to say is that to prepare this round table, I talked of an anecdote that I find very interesting because it didn't take place in France, but in England. And therefore, with a certain liberalism, a liberal approach of mobility techniques, there are authorities in England that organize things. One is called Transport for London. And 2 years ago, Uber was forbidden any activity on the London territory because they didn't respect the sustainable mobility objectives set by the London mayor. And therefore, for 18 months, they were not able to develop their activities and to come back to the market. They had to commit to ensure complementary modes. And we see that very well around the world, this notion of a couple between the organizational authority and delegates organizing public transport, or private companies, or companies with licenses to organize transportation, are all important. And I know that we work in southern countries. We always insist on the fact that the presence of this organizing authority be present to cover all of the mobilities today. If in a few months we will be able to inaugurate a TER train in Dakar, it is because there is an organizational authority there. and helps organizing everything. It is still maybe too close to the president, but there are, of course, a certain number of simplifications and delegations that could be made to give power to this organization. But a few years ago, we held a conference in Addis Ababa, and I remember that that was a transport network that worked pretty well. And we have a strong state there that organized complementarity between public transportation and informal transportation. So there's a governance, a need for integration and of all the different actors. And this is something that seems very important for us to make sure that there is true sustainable mobility. Yes, I see we have just a few minutes before concluding. Please do not hesitate to ask your question in the chat. We will try to answer. But yes, indeed, things are moving along, moving forward, and Charlene said that things are moving slowly, but still changing. So this is a good thing. And we received a few questions, namely from Baya Benica, who asked about the improvement of air and the decrease of gas emissions. Does that help say that things are better because of the lockdown? And the gas emissions, are they going to increase very high after the end of the lockdown? Of course, there has been a decrease in terms of gas emissions. Mr. Lebras? Yes, we need to be careful. These are the effects in terms of pollution. During the first lockdown, we noticed a decrease in terms of gas emissions, but when we stopped the lockdown, there was a lack of trust of the users in terms of public transportation. And in fact, the local effects for this decrease of pollutions were very quickly erased. And we will only be able to work and tackle these gas emission issues with structural changes and behavior changes that are sustainable. So from this point of view, the crisis has opened a small window, if I can say so, to show us the path to less emissions, but unfortunately, the effect wasn't that sustainable. So we hope we will not need new lockdowns in the future. Another question about air and maritime transportation. For these two transport modes that were not included in the Paris Agreement, and the objectives became clear afterwards, would someone from Climate Change like to answer? I can take the floor. For maritime and air transport, these, of course, were not included in the Paris Agreement, but these are sectors that committed on their own, and the two specialized agencies for maritime transport and air transport, FORCIA, each established their decrease of emissions by 2030. And the problem of pollution, of course, is true for maritime transport. As we said in the beginning of the presentation, to start implementing new norm for 2021 and decrease sulfur emissions that escape from the boats and ships in ports, we need to impose new standards for levels of sulfur, and the maritime structures will need to comply. They will need to use new equipment. There are control towers to control these emissions. They're called scrummers, and they will be adopted massively by maritime industries. And there is now new competitivity with these alternative combustibles. For air transport, In 2021, there's a pilot phase of the program Corsia, to compensate for emissions by air transport, to compensate all of the supplementary emissions after the levels that were set for air companies. For 2020, of course, it is an exceptional year, as we know. So the rules were modified, the objectives as well. And so now what counts are the figures from 2019, and air companies are going to start buying carbon credit in order to, on the one hand, compensate for their emissions and commit and engage to transform their technologies, thanks to hydrogen, for example, electrification as well. And French recovery plants were launched as well. And in companies like such as Airbus. Thank you very much. It is now 12 o'clock. We are on time, and I will therefore suggest to close these discussions, this meeting for today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for all the speakers. And thank you, Concepcion, for hosting and moderating this roundtable today. You can look at all the discussions again on our website, Climate Chance. We would also like to briefly thank our partners who help us work and to create this report, the Michelin Foundation, of course. And we thank Ms. for your presence today. And thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. This afternoon, there is another roundtable on the land use. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Merci, au revoir.